Okay, graphical tools. Economists, they use tools to illustrate how individuals make choices. So we'll introduce them for you to be familiar. Let's start off with the individual objectives. The economic model of behavior state that people acquire goods that maximize personal satisfaction. And in economics, they refer to it as utility. So this desired goal is to maximize utility, to maximize personal satisfaction. So how people make choices, economists represent individual preferences by a utility function. Utility function, it expresses the relation between total utility and the level of goods consumed. The objective is to maximize this function given the budget constraints. The concept can be illustrated through a simple example where individuals only care about two goods. So for this example, we'll have food and clothing. You value these two goods. Thus, utility rises with both food and clothing. So in this case, your specific utility function is utility is food and clothing. So for instance, you have 16 units of food and 25 units of clothing. So how much is your utility? So that this would be 4 and this would be 5. So you have 20 as your utility. So if you have 25 units of food and also 25 units of clothing, then you're way better off with this because you'll be having a utility of 25. So which maximizes personal satisfaction, which maximizes your preference. It's at 25 as opposed to only 20. So you're better off with 25 units of food and 25 units of clothing. But utility function, they rank alternative bundles of food and clothing in the order of most preferred to least preferred. But we can show this graphically in what we call as indifference curve. So let's look at indifference curve. We already established that utility is equal to food and clothing. So let's represent this through a indifference curve. Indifference, okay? Meaning, wala ka ng pake, okay? Okay? Regardless if I get 4 quantity of 4 units of food and 16 units of clothing, or if I'd get 16 units of food and 4 units of clothing, as long as I would get a utility of 8. Okay? As long as I would get a utility of 8. Okay? So, let's plot this. What are the possibilities of getting a utility of 8? Okay? So, to get a utility of 8, that would mean that you would get the combination of 16 food and 4 clothing, or 4 unit of food and 16 unit of clothing. So all of these combination would give you a utility of 8. So let's plot this. Okay. So to get an 8, you may have this. Okay. 16 unit of food and 4 unit of clothing. Okay. Or a combination of 16 unit of clothing and 4 unit of food. So this is your indifferent curve. And within this curve, you would get, regardless if it's here, the point is here, the point is here, you would get a utility of 8. So, wala ka ng pake if nandito you have the quantity of food and clothing here, or you have the point here, as long as it's in the curve, and you would get a utility of 8. So this is your indifferent curve. So meaning, if we have this curve, you would prefer, okay, this area would be preferred. This area is preferred. It's because it's way beyond the curve and you would be more satisfied. While this area here, okay, brings you lower utility. So this area here, below the curve, is not preferred. So let's plot our given utilities. What if we have the 25 units of food and 16 units of clothing? What if we have the 25 units of clothing and 16 units of food? So this curve right here would bring you a utility of 20, right? So, since it would give you a utility of 20, you'd be much more satisfied, be much more happier with these choices. Okay? You're more happy as opposed to just a utility of 8. So, isa lang smiley. Okay? So the indifference curve show all the combination of food and clothing that yield the same level of utility. Okay, for the utility of 8, these are the combinations of food and clothing. For the utility of 20, within this curve are the combinations of food and clothing. Of course, you would want more of both food and clothing. Unfortunately, you would face budget constraint that will limit your purchase. So suppose you have an income that would affect the quantity of food and clothing that you would purchase. So let's present it in a formula. So for budget constraint, your income should be more than the price of your food and the price of your clothing. That should be it. And it can be rearranged through this formula. But what's better off is to present this in a graph. So let's present this in a graph. So to better illustrate this, let's have an example. Let's say you're earning 1,000 pesos in a month. Okay, masyadong maliit, no? Pero for the sake of example, let's say you're earning 1,000 peso in a month. And the price of clothing, let's say the price of clothing is at 200 pesos. And the price of food is at 100 pesos. So the price of clothing is at 200 and the price of food is at 100. So there are a lot of combinations of food and clothing in which each price would not exceed 1,000. Okay? So there are a lot of combination between clothing and food that would not exceed your income, which is 1,000. So what are those combinations? Let's say you have bought two clothings at 200 peso. So you have 400. So let's say you have two clothings at 200 pesos, then you have 400. And a combination of 6 clothes. Okay? So that would give you exactly 1,000. Or a combination of 3 clothings and 4 food. So that would give you 1,000. Or how about 4 clothing and 2 food? Okay? So this line right here, is your budget constraint. Meaning you shouldn't go beyond this line, or else you would exceed your budget, your income of 1,000. And in this, okay, and what's below this curve is within your budget. So, what's below this line is affordable. And this right here is unaffordable. So what would happen if you have a higher income? You gain promotion. So this is your budget constraint at 1,000. If you get a higher income, meaning this line would shift. Okay? So let's say, okay? So let's say you got a higher income of 1,500 per month. So your budget constraint moves, okay, from the original consumption opportunities. If your income would lower, then of course, Okay, it would go here in this line. Okay, so this is higher income, and this would be lower income. So the slope does not change because there is no change in the price of two goods. It's still at 200 and 100 peso. Okay, so the the slope of the line is still the same. Okay, for the budget constraint. So what would happen if the price changes? Okay, so let's say nagmura si clothing, naging 100 pesos na siya. Mura na mura. So what are those possible combination that still pasok sa budget na 1,000 pesos? So let's say with 1,000 pesos, you can buy 5 clothing. See here, 5. 5 clothing and 5 food. With 1,000 pesos, you can buy 6 clothing and 4 food. Okay. With 1,000 pesos, you can buy 7 clothing and 3 food. Or with 1,000 peso, you can buy 8 food, 8 food and 2 clothing. So this will be now your new line for budget constraint. Okay. So the slope of the line changes. It's because of the pricing. So changes in the price of clothing change the slope of the budget constraint. Higher prices produce a steeper line and lower prices produce a flatter line. So let's combine indifference curve and the budget constraint. Okay. So recall that if we want a utility of 8, it should be within this indifferent curve. And if we want a utility of 20, it should be within this curve. Of course, you'd be much happier. You would be more happier if you have higher utility. But it's because of budget constraint, you shouldn't go beyond. Okay, you'd be happier, but wouldn't be able to afford it. It's because of your income. So, what should we do? How should we choose? The individual's best choice is choosing a point where the budget constraint is tangent to the curve. You would want at least a utility of 8. So the tangent would be here, right? You would be able to afford it and you'd be satisfied at a utility of 8. Why? Because look at it. If you want a utility of 20, but you would go beyond your budget constraint, you wouldn't be able to afford it. But what if, let's say, you have here a utility, you have here a curve with a utility. For the sake of example, you have here a utility of 5. Of course, with your budget, this is affordable. But let's look at your utility. You only have a utility of 5. You wouldn't be satisfied with your choice. We want the optimal choice. So our optimal choice here is the tangent between the constraint and the curve. So I hope we're clear.